everybody, and welcome to today's video. Unfortunately, the video today is going to be quite negative in tone, and I don't like to do that much on this channel because I would rather use this channel to be an uplifting look at the games that deserve to be recognized as excellent examples of their art form, particularly the niche ones that don't get talked about so much. But sometimes a game comes along that just needs to be talked about because for all the wrong reasons it's quite notable. I will have a full review up on digitallydownloaded.net as well of this game, but I'm going to use this video to talk about one particular element of it because I feel like in this one particular regard the developers were incredibly cynical about how they went about this game, and I feel like they've really let the audience down. They've been quite arrogant about it, to be honest, and it just deserves to be recognized as how you should not go about game development. I am talking about this new Dungeons & Dragons game, Dark Alliance, which I find to be an absolutely appalling use of the license and something that really misses the mark on every level. I feel like they've deliberately done so. So when Dark Alliance was first announced, the really exciting thing for fans was that it was going to be a Drizzt Do Urden game. Now, if you haven't heard of Drizzt Do Urden before, he is a major character that has appeared in 30-odd books by an author called R.A. Salvatore, and he has become very iconic to the Dungeons & Dragons brand. He is basically the lead character in their whole novel side of the business, and for many people, including me, who grew up playing Dungeons & Dragons, Drizzt Do Urden and his characters represented the kind of storytelling vibe of the Dungeons & Dragons property. So he is very important to the entire Dungeons & Dragons license, and when it was announced that the game was going to be about him and his allies going on a quest together, naturally we were all quite excited, but right from the start there were some red flags that were raised for me, which had me concerned that perhaps the developers were going to be using this license in quite a cynical way to sell copies of what was otherwise a pretty unremarkable RPG. Firstly, the game doesn't even have all the characters that are important to the books. So in Dark Alliance you can play as one of 4 different characters: Bruno, Drizzt Do Urden himself of course, Canterbury and Wulfgar. And those were the 4 characters that did the bulk of the fighting in the books. But there was a 5th character who was absolutely critical to the plot of most of those novels, and he doesn't appear because he doesn't really have a combat role in those stories. His name is Regis. Regis is a halfling. He wasn't particularly physically formidable, but he was a very intellectual kind of character. He was very clever. He was a thief-like character, so he was always very nimble. He was good at getting himself into and out of trouble, and he was a delight of the party. He added a lot of characterization to the books. He added a lot of party dynamics. And for the bulk of the books where there was not combat, he played a really starring role. His absence from the game immediately told me that this game was not going to be so much about the characters, but merely just endless fighting. Because if they were going to have a story-driven experience, they would have no reason not to have Regis in there in a prominent role. So following on from that, the focus on combat in Dark Alliance really misses the point of Drizzt Do Urden and his characters and those books, because while they are pulpy fantasy and full of action, that's not just what they're about. The author, Salvatore, always worked really hard to contextualize that action, to make it have meaning, have purpose, and these books cover a huge range of themes, from morality and mortality to racism, to having all these characters that are kind of dark mirrors to the important characters. The villains are always reflective of some kind of important theme and philosophy. And in fact, if you read those books, at the start of every kind of major chapter within them, there's always a couple of pages in which it's kind of presented like Drizzt Do Urden is writing a letter or writing in a journal. And it's always these kinds of musings on life and love and relationships and morality and all of those kinds of things. It gets quite philosophical. It's never dense, but it's certainly got ideas that it wants to share and communicate and encourage its readers to think. So while these books aren't Lord of the Rings, they are certainly not just endless action. But this game is endless action. That's all they've put in there. There's these tablets that you can pick up which have kind of some lore around the edges. There's these little introductions to each combat chapter which tell you what your characters are doing, but there's certainly no sense of storytelling beyond the immediate. There's nothing in here that isn't directly related to the battles that you're going to be fighting. Once you're in the dungeons, all they do is fight. There's a little bit of banter between characters. They all have their little quips and things, but there's certainly none of the depth of storytelling that is in these books. And I think that's a missed target. I mean, we are talking about the RPG genre here. It is certainly capable of telling some excellent stories, but this developer has just ignored all of that to instead just throw combat at the players and give you characters that vaguely look like these book characters. At least, you know, the impression you probably have in your head about what these book characters look like. They vaguely resemble them, but they certainly don't talk, behave, or act like them. So it doesn't feel like an authentic experience on any level. It feels like, once again, the developers has just used these characters knowing they're popular, and by throwing them into a combat game, people can feel like they're playing as their favourite character in theory, but in practice, it doesn't really feel that way at all. So another area where the game really misunderstands the characters and the whole storytelling experience of these Drizzt Do Urden books is in the loot system. Dark Alliance has a loot system that works exactly like Diablo and all those other games, where you, as you go through dungeons, you end up with a big pile of loot, which allows you to continuously upgrade your character's, you know, armor and weapons with common, uncommon, rare, super rare, legendary equipment, whatever, and then also upgrade them so that you can make them more powerful. You get a lot of customization over this. There's a lot of different types of loot, and it all very much works like Diablo. The thing is, though, in the Drizzt books, these characters have iconic weapons to go with their iconic characterization. So Canterbury has her very famous bow and her kind of semi-evil, very savage sword that she's managed to come to control. Drizzt Do Urden has these magical anklets which give him superhuman speed, and then he's got two magical swords. One's called Twinkle, the other one's called Icing Death, which he picks up through his adventures and they become core to his character. Wulfgar has a warhammer which is carved for him, which is manufactured for him, which is crafted for him, that's the word I was looking for, which is crafted for him by Bruenor. It's a gift from father to son, or adopted son in this case, and it means a lot to the character. In the game, none of this means anything because you get new swords, you get new bows, you get new hammers and whatever by just running through the dungeon. It doesn't mean any, the equipment doesn't mean anything to the characters. It's all very, you know, it's all very utility based. You use it, then you discard it when you get something better. So that misunderstands the whole importance of the weapons to these characters and what it means to their characterization. Ideally, if this game was going to be a true Drizzt Do Urden game, then there wouldn't be that loot system, or if there was, it would be related to things other than the actual swords and weapons that they wore. Perhaps you could have the armor change from one level to the next, because the armor was less iconic to the characters, but certainly the equipment, the weapons shouldn't be changeable. That was pretty important to the characters, and the developers really missed the mark there. Finally, the game doesn't really have a narrative that is in any way related to the books. It takes place vaguely after the conclusion of a trilogy early on in the novel series, but it is independent of what happens in the novel series after that trilogy. And while I understand the developers' desire to tell a different story and to tell their own story within this universe, there doesn't seem to be any indication that they've tried to understand why these books, these stories were so popular and have been over such a long period of time. So, for example, they've really resisted making the primary enemies of each of these games and the story arcs something that is relatable to the characters beyond the combat situation. So the most famous enemy in the Drizzt Do Urden novels is an assassin called Artemis Entreri. And Artemis Entreri was a dark mirror to Drizzt Do Urden. They had very similar fighting styles, and as the books kind of drive home over and over again, they could have been they are basically the same as one another. They're a dark mirror to one another in different circumstances. Drizzt could have turned out to be Artemis Entreri. Artemis Entreri could have turned out to be Drizzt Do Urden. It was just a couple of things here and there across their lives that has ended up with them being rivals and kind of on the opposite end of the moral scale. There's no effort to create that kind of characterization within the enemies in Dark Alliance. They're just enemies that you kill and then move on to the next level. So again, the game lacks the storytelling understanding and nuance of these books, and in doing so, it just doesn't have the character of the books. without his rivals, Drizzt is not the same character. And I think that the developers here just have misunderstood what these books are about in their entirety. So in conclusion, in addition to the AI issues, which I will be talking about in my review, of which there are huge issues there, in addition to the game being pretty bland beyond being quite attractive, it has got a nice visual style, but other than that, it doesn't do anything interesting with its level design. The loot system is there, but it's not particularly inspiring. The combat, the enemy encounters, even if the AI was good, would not be anything standout. There's nothing about this game that really stands out. In addition to all of that, the characterization and the fact that this is supposedly a Drizzt game is a huge disappointment. And I did interview these developers about this stuff way back. Just after the game was announced, I sent all these questions over to them. They took forever to get back to me, and their answers were really less than satisfactory. I didn't actually end up even publishing the interview as a result. And you can see why. I mean, right from the start, I think they knew that this game was not going to be a particularly authentic Drizzt Do Urden game, and I think that they haven't delivered. So, yeah, even if they were to fix the gameplay issues, this game is still going to be a hard pass for me, especially if you are a fan of Drizzt Do Urden. It doesn't do anything right by the genre, or by the character, by the game, and indeed the whole RPG genre. It's just a mess, which is unfortunate, and I hated to do this video, but I did have things to talk about, because licensing is obviously very important to video games, and I still believe that in a lot of cases developers take these licenses on and then cynically exploit them to make money out of the people who are fans of them without ever intending on doing them justice, and I think that's what's happened here. Anyway, thanks very much for tuning in. Do hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoy my videos. As I'm sure anybody who regularly watches me know, I'm generally much more positive about the games that I play than this one, especially on this channel. And if you do like my work, please do consider backing me on Patreon. You can do so for $1 a month or more if you're feeling generous. And by doing so, you're supporting these videos, the work I do on digitallydownloaded.net, the visual novels I make, and on top of that, you do get a monthly magazine, which is exclusive to Patreon backers. So thanks as always for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.